Jim Carrey walked away from his avatar. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. But deliberately, like someone stepping out of a costume that had begun to suffocate him. He didn't quit acting altogether. He didn't disappear from public life. Instead, he did something far more unsettling. He told the truth about the performance. He exposed the mechanism. He said the quiet part out loud, that fame does not reward the self, it replaces it. And once you hear that idea, you can't unhear it. So the question returns, heavier now than before. What happens when someone doesn't walk away from the avatar? What happens when they stay inside it for decades? Steve Harvey and the burden of being right. Steve Harvey is not just famous. He is trusted. That distinction matters. Actors play roles. Musicians perform emotions. Comedians exaggerate reality. But Steve Harvey occupies a rarer, more dangerous position. He gives advice. He explains life. He tells people how to think about marriage, masculinity, faith, discipline, and success. When someone holds that position, the stakes change. A mistake is no longer just a mistake. It's a contradiction. A flaw is no longer human. It's hypocrisy. So the avatar must be reinforced constantly. Steve Harvey's books, Act Like a Lady, Think Like a Man, Straight Talk, No Chaser, Jump, are built on certainty. They do not suggest. They declare. They tell the reader, this is how the world works. And certainty is comforting. People gravitate toward voices that sound sure of themselves, especially in a chaotic world. Steve Harvey's tone is paternal, grounded, firm. He speaks like someone who has figured it out, and that confidence is part of the brand. But confidence is also fragile. Because once you claim authority, you lose the freedom to be wrong. So ask yourself, how does someone who built their career on certainty handle doubt? Where does confusion go when it's not allowed to exist publicly? The silence between the stories. Steve Harvey tells a very specific story about his life. The struggle, the homelessness, the faith, the breakthrough, the reward. It is clean, linear, inspirational. But real lives are rarely that neat. There are gaps in every public narrative, moments that don't fit the message, conflicts that complicate the lesson, decisions that might weaken the authority of the storyteller if revealed fully. Those moments don't disappear. They go silent. And silence, over time, becomes pressure. Katt Williams' criticisms resonate with some people not because they are provable point by point, but because they target that silence. He speaks into the spaces where the official story feels incomplete. Why do certain comedians rise while others stall? Why are some voices amplified and others erased? Why does respectability matter more than originality in mainstream success? These questions don't accuse. They interrogate. And interrogation is dangerous for an avatar built on certainty. The industry's unwritten rules. Hollywood rarely rewards rebellion for long. It rewards compliance, disguised as professionalism. Steve Harvey understands this better than most. He learned early that to survive, you must become predictable in the right ways. You must be reliable to networks, sponsors, advertisers, and audiences. That doesn't mean he lacks talent. It doesn't mean he lacks work ethic. It means he understands the game. Katt Williams, by contrast, refuses the game. And refusal has consequences. Katt's career has been chaotic, uneven, volatile. He has faced legal trouble, public ridicule, and industry exile. Yet despite all of this, he maintains something Steve Harvey cannot afford to display openly. Rage, bitterness, defiance, vulnerability. Katt Williams bleeds in public. Steve Harvey does not. Which raises an unsettling question. Is emotional chaos punished because it is wrong? Or because it cannot be controlled? The email revisited. Power and distance. Let's return to the 2017 email. On the surface, it's about boundaries. About efficiency. About protecting time. But underneath, it reveals hierarchy. Do not approach unless invited. Do not wait outside. Do not interrupt. These are not requests. They are commands. And commands are not issued by the warm uncle figure audiences see on television. They are issued by executives, authority figures, men who understand their value and enforce distance to protect it. Steve Harvey did not become cold overnight. He became powerful. And power, once obtained, changes the texture of relationships. People no longer interact with you freely. They approach carefully, strategically, often fearfully. The avatar demands separation. And separation breeds loneliness. So again, we must ask, who does Steve Harvey get to be when the cameras are off? Faith as structure, not just belief. Steve Harvey frequently credits God for his success. Faith is central to his narrative. It provides meaning, justification, and moral grounding. It frames his rise as destiny rather than coincidence. But faith can also function as structure. It organizes chaos. It justifies hierarchy. It explains success without questioning systems. If God rewarded Steve Harvey, then questioning the process becomes uncomfortable. It shifts the focus away from industry dynamics, privilege, and timing, and toward morality. And morality is much harder to argue with. Katt Williams challenges this framing indirectly. By pointing to patterns, who benefits, who disappears, he reframes success as something more strategic than spiritual. That doesn't mean Steve Harvey's faith is fake. But it does mean faith can coexist with calculation. And that coexistence is rarely discussed. The reinvention problem. Public reinvention is celebrated in celebrity culture. A new look, a new tone, a new chapter. But reinvention also allows erasure. When Steve Harvey shaved his head, the conversation focused on confidence and maturity. The earlier image, the high-top fade, the flashier persona, was quietly retired. No contradiction. No reckoning. Just progression. But what happens when reinvention becomes habitual? When each version replaces the last without acknowledgement? At what point does adaptation turn into avoidance? Jim Carrey confronted this question head-on. He admitted that each reinvention pulled him further from a stable sense of self. He recognized that the applause was not for him, but for the character people wanted him to be. Steve Harvey, so far, has chosen a different path. He refines the avatar. He strengthens it. He upgrades it. And the world rewards him for it. Public authority and private cost. There is a cost to being a symbol. You must always be composed. You must always be correct. You must always be aligned with your message. Mistakes must be reframed. Contradictions must be minimized. Criticism must be dismissed or absorbed without visible impact. Over time, this creates emotional numbness. Not because the person stops feeling, but because feeling becomes dangerous. Jim Carrey described this numbness as the moment when depression begins. When the inner self realizes it no longer has permission to exist. Steve Harvey has never publicly acknowledged such a struggle. That doesn't mean it isn't there. It means it hasn't been allowed into the story. The audience's role. Here is the part most people avoid. The avatar exists because we reward it. We prefer certainty over honesty. We prefer confidence over complexity. We prefer inspiration over contradiction. We ask public figures to be symbols, then punish them when they behave like humans. Steve Harvey did not create this system alone. Katt Williams did not break it alone. Jim Carrey did not escape it easily. We participate every time we elevate an image and ignore the cost behind it. So the real question may not be, is Steve Harvey authentic? But rather, what do we demand from the people we admire? Two paths. Two consequences. Jim Carrey chose exposure. Katt Williams chose confrontation. Steve Harvey chose preservation. None of these paths are painless. Exposure leads to isolation. Confrontation leads to exile. Preservation leads to imprisonment inside an image. There is no perfect choice, only trade-offs. Steve Harvey's life is materially successful, professionally stable, culturally respected. But stability is not the same as freedom. And freedom is not always visible. The question that remains. When you watch Steve Harvey today, laughing on Family Feud, delivering advice, speaking about faith and discipline, what are you really seeing? A man. A brand. An avatar refined by decades of expectation? And if the advice helps people, does the origin matter? Is truth measured by intention, or by impact? And finally, the most uncomfortable question of all. If you were in his position, rewarded for the image, protected by the performance, would you step out of the avatar? Or would you protect it too? Because once the world decides who you are, walking away is no longer just a personal choice. It's a risk. Under the bright, unforgiving lights of a comedy club, the truth looks different. It is sharper there, edged by breath and timing, measured in seconds where laughter either arrives like a warm tide or fails like a struck bell. On television, truth is gentler. It is massaged into a narrative, trimmed to fit a segment, dressed by wardrobe and sound cues, then presented as something that was always meant to be. The argument between Katt Williams and Steve Harvey was never only about jokes. It was a clash of epistemologies, of how truth is constructed, who gets to tell it, and which version the public chooses to believe. To read the headlines, the tweets and the think pieces, you would think the fight began with a single sentence, a line cast like a spear into the shallow end of celebrity discourse. But like most cultural earthquakes, it had subterranean tremors that had been building for years. Small resentments, casual contradictions, the slow accretion of image work that eventually calcified into doubt. It began, in one retelling, with an old photograph. A grainy snapshot of a younger Steve Harvey on a bus somewhere between gigs, an expression that could be read as exhaustion or calculation. For Katt, the picture read as evidence of an empire that had been meticulously staged. For Steve's supporters, it was a relic of the hustle that had forged him. Both readings were true in ways. Both were incomplete. The debate that followed threaded through interviews, late-night shows, private conversations turned public, and stand-up sets that folded accusation into punchline. Katt's critique wasn't merely that Steve had built an impenetrable persona. It was that the persona had become a functional product that insulated the man inside it from scrutiny. Steve's narrators, the writers and producers who had carved that narrative, were the product managers of a brand that sold wisdom, warmth, and the kind of moral clarity that made the American living room feel smaller, kinder, and more comprehensible. What does a product do when it learns how to cry on command? Katt asked once from the stage, pacing like a man trying to measure the distance between two truths. When it knows how to pause, how to look into the camera like it loves you, like it's telling you something sacred. Is that still a person talking to you, or is that something that's learned your patterns and is trying to make money off of them? The room went quiet. That was the power of Katt's interrogation. It refused to let laughter be the closing argument. He wanted the audience to hold the joke in one hand and the morality of its telling in the other. Steve, for his part, remained mostly silent in the early days of the public friction. Silence doesn't always mean submission. Sometimes it is strategy. Sometimes it is a refusal to join a spectacle that would, once participated in, only amplify the construction it relied upon. Steve's silence, when read as complicity, inflamed critics. Read as restraint, it was the kind of measured pause that had made him a reliable figure for decades. Which interpretation you favored tended to reveal more about your prior orientation toward celebrity than about the men themselves. The flashpoints were specific and human. Katt challenged the authenticity of Steve's poverty-to-triumph narrative. The story of sleeping in a car, of nights counted by the cold of a steering wheel. Katt did not deny the reality of hardship, only the neat, marketable contours around it. You can be poor, he would say, and still be strategizing like you've got an audience waiting. That's not humility. That's a rehearsal for the future you're going to sell. He pointed to numbers, tours, certain dates when income had been reported, not to deny sacrifice, but to complicate the linearity people loved in a rags-to-riches arc. If a professional life had complexity, then why was the story so simple? Katt's questions became a kind of skeptical hygiene, not to tear down necessarily, but to ask whether we had let myth do the heavy lifting where truth belonged. Those questions forced people to look at the ways the industry preserves its own. Television is among the most efficient myth machines ever invented. It compresses narratives and distributes them widely, using repetition to make familiarity feel like fact. Have you ever noticed how repeating a memory enough turns it into an accepted truth, no matter how malleable its origin? When certain lines were told about Steve again and again, about the car, about the rejections, the moral lessons gleaned from suffering, they ceased to be contested memories and instead became the scaffolding of a persona. There's an economy to that scaffolding. Brands need predictability. Audiences need anchors. Producers and networks need personas that can reliably deliver engagement. The system rewards consistency. It flattens risk. And from the flattened surface, a performer can extract enormous value. But what is flattened loses depth. It loses the capacity to surprise. Katt's position was unapologetic. Surprise is the test of artistry. On a film set, you are asked not to be yourself but to disappear into someone else. It is an existential test. Can you be less than you were for the role? Katt had always made the case that great performers are those who surrender the ego long enough to let another identity live in them. Steve, Katt argued, never had that erasure. The man on screen was always visible beneath the role, an anchor tethered to the same center of gravity. That critique struck at something deeper than performance technique. It questioned whether our culture privileged the product over the person. If television is an industry that packages emotional responses for consumption, then who owns the authenticity when we respond? Does laughter belong to the subject on stage, or to the designers of a brand engineered to make us laugh? Katt was not content with theoretical dissection. He aimed to historicize the problem. He told stories about the early days of comedy circuits, about club owners and agents and the myth-making that often occurred in back rooms. He claimed that historical narratives, who had been at which club and when, were being edited to produce lineage, to create a perception of pedigree. In Katt's telling, some careers had been retold as if they were inevitable, as if greatness had always been present. That retelling, he argued, was a tool. But the history itself was messy. People drink, forget, embellish. Memory is porous, and comedians, perhaps more than others, decorate memory as part of their craft. You can hear a claim in a routine and wonder if the storyteller is exaggerating for effect or merely embellishing a loose truth. Katt wanted to pull apart the embroidery until the thread revealed itself. Which stories were performance and which were memory? Who's the arbiter of comedy history? He asked on a panel one night. Who decides which names get pressed into the pantheon? Is it the clubs? The networks? Or are we handing that crown to people who know how to package themselves? The question hung heavy because it implicated institutions. It implicated the practices of marketing, the quiet arithmetic of time slots and syndication deals, the power of gatekeepers who could, by favor or omission, lift someone into a legacy or consign them to obscurity. The comedy world, once seen as an oasis of contrarian voices, had become a market like any other. Its products were not just jokes but personae. One of Katt's most incendiary claims involved Bernie Mack. To many, Bernie had been the volcanic force of the Kings of Comedy tour, a comic whose voice demanded attention and whose timing could alternate between gentle and remorseless. Katt's contention was not merely that Bernie was talented. It was that Bernie's talent had been visible in a way others had not, that he had been brave enough to translate stand-up's rawness into cinematic presence. And Katt alleged that when film opportunities surfaced, Steve had attempted to redirect them. Those were damning words because they suggested active interference in another man's career. If true, they recast industry success not as meritocratic but as political, an arena where relationships and leverage could trump raw talent. The story, Katt claimed with a measure of righteous anger, was more complicated than the smooth narrative of unity the public had received. Accusation crucibles audiences into two camps. One camp saw Katt as a truth-teller, a contrarian unwilling to accept packaged narratives. The other saw him as a provocateur, throwing red meat into a culture hungry for spectacle. Both readings were simplified in their own ways. Katt was both, a man who loved the stage and hated the compromises made to protect a marketable image. Steve was both, a man who had crafted a dependable public voice and, in doing so, had protected himself and his family from the precarity that often devoured entertainers. The debate spilled into the lives of other comedians, some of whom watched with shark-like patience, waiting for reputations to clarify and for alliances to form. The industry is an ecosystem. When one predator lashes out, others adjust. Some comedians publicly supported Katt for his courage. Others defended Steve's empire-building as the rational choice in an industry that consumes youthful brilliance and dispenses it sparingly. But this was not merely a conversation about power dynamics. It was a meditation on fear and risk. What do you risk when you trade vulnerability for consistency? For Steve, consistency had become the currency of safety. For Katt, vulnerability was the only measure that mattered. It was the place where truth could be found. You can't be famous and honest at the same time if honesty costs you the brand, Katt told a crowd, his voice a mixture of exhaustion and fumes of righteous rage. People have died in this business because someone else needed the stage. Don't tell me the system's innocent. People laughed, nervously, reflexively, and then considered the question. How many careers had been carefully pruned so that certain faces would flourish? How many voices had been hushed as collateral damage for a clean, marketable persona? These were the kinds of inquiries that do not settle neatly. They ripple outward, touching managers, agents, investors, and, most importantly, audiences. For the public, the stakes were moral but also personal. We have a hunger for stories of hardship and redemption, and those stories can be nourishing. But what happens when the story is an assembly line? When the image is not the expression of a person's life, but instead the shape of a shape designed to elicit sympathy? Does that change how we relate to the advice those figures dispense? If a motivational anecdote is curated more than lived, does its value change? At the heart of the debate was a simple, human question. When you turn to a figure for guidance, are you listening to someone who has held what they preach in the dark, unrecorded nights? Or are you consuming a product that has been optimized to feel like comfort? Anecdotes multiplied, producers who insisted on certain wardrobe choices to soften a persona, focus groups that critiqued a laugh line as too sharp for the target demo, syndicated columns that repackaged personal misfortune as lesson-driven content. These were not conspiratorial details. They were ordinary mechanics of a cultural industry. But seen together, they painted a picture of stewardship. Someone had tended to the public face diligently. Katt accused, and sometimes he mocked. He threw absurdist hypotheticals into the mix to puncture complacency. Imagine, he said once, grinning with malicious delight, if someone outsourced grief to a PR firm. They'd have a grief schedule. Wednesday afternoons, sentimental Instagram posts. Saturday morning, heartfelt podcast. You'd call it performance art. Except it would be real money. The laughter that followed masked something uncomfortable. The audience enjoyed the paradox. They liked the idea of irony. They relished the critique that pulsated at the core of celebrity life. But there was also a private acknowledgement. We had become expert consumers of constructed pain and polished triumphs. The silence from Steve, whether strategic or weary, allowed space for the media to narrate. Silence is not absence. It is a canvas others are free to paint on. For many viewers, the choice to accept the constructed narrative was still voluntary. We can consume with cynicism or we can consume with belief. Both experiences are forms of agency, though Katt would argue one is more honest than the other. But the argument that truth must hover outside of systems that protect the product needs to be tested, not merely asserted. Katt's idealization of the stand-up stage as an Eden of unmediated truth falls into romanticism. Stages are also markets. Clubs have owners. Owners have cards to play. Comedians lie to themselves about their independence as much as anyone else. There is no pristine place in show business where money, fear, or vanity does not intrude. Katt knows this. His critique is not naive. It is strategic. He wanted to hold up a mirror to the industry and force it, and the public, to squint. What if you valued honesty so much that you were willing to permit improvised failure? What if you didn't instinctively reach for the polished narrative, but instead asked for the ragged one? It would be messier. It would be less marketable. It might, Katt hoped, be more instructive. This was not an argument that one man was wholly right and the other wholly wrong. It was an argument that exposed the scarcity of moral categories available to us in an age where image economies shape perception. It asked us to add adjectives to people rather than label them icons. Steve could be compassionate and cautious, generous and risk-averse. Katt could be incendiary and incisive, truthful and performative. In the weeks and months that followed the most public moments of the dispute, the conversation fractured into hundreds of micro-debates. Podcasts where comedians traded stories about backroom deals, think pieces that traced the sociology of celebrity, Twitter threads where anonymous insiders claimed knowledge and were promptly contradicted. The noise was overwhelming, but it also humanized the situation. Conversations that started as hot media cycles wound their way into living rooms, barbershops, and classrooms. Teachers used the debate to discuss how narratives are formed. Workshop leaders used it to talk about craft versus commerce. People began to parse their own relationships with public figures. A fan who had always trusted Steve's motivational aphorisms might now wonder, did the advice come from a lived wound or from an edited script? That doubt is a small private erosion, but it changes how counsel is received. Advice relies on perceived authenticity. If the messenger is a commodity, the message can feel like product copy. And yet, in the quiet places, backstage, in hotel rooms, on roads between gigs, real human stories continued to unfold that did not fit neatly into any brand. A comedian who broke down after a bad set, a host who stayed late to comfort a production assistant, a veteran who watched younger comics scramble for social media traction and remembered the slow, exhausting path of the circuit. Those moments were not always spectacular. They were often plain. They didn't make for a viral clip. But they were the human stuff that lies behind personas. By the time people stopped watching the spectacle for spectacle's sake and began to look for meaning, the debate had done something important. It taught audiences to be a little less credulous. That might feel small. It might feel like a chip taken from something larger and more dazzling. But questions, once introduced, have inertia. They prompt scrutiny. They complicate the simple comforts we love. What do you want from the people who make you laugh? Katt asked in a more reflective tone during one late-night appearance. Do you want to be promised a sermon, or do you want someone to risk being wrong in front of you? That's a heavy ask. But maybe it's the only way we stop buying the same product wrapped in different paper. The public's answer was divided and uneven, as public answers often are. Some doubled down on the comforts of a dependable voice. They wanted someone who could be their moral weather forecast. Others, weary of packaged authenticity, leaned toward the messy, risky, and occasionally infuriating truth. What remained unquestionable was that the dispute forced institutions to notice. Networks started to be more cautious in how they curated life stories. Producers asked whether an overpolished image might be costing them the very authenticity they claimed to cherish. Clubs placed a premium on long-form performances where jokes could breathe and risk could be measured. For a fleeting period, the industry remembered that unpredictability could be its most valuable export. In the end, nobody was crowned. There was no definitive judgment. Bernie Mack's legacy remained luminous and complicated. Steve Harvey's brand remained prosperous and influential, and Katt Williams' challenge continued to echo in places he might never know. The argument did not resolve into a simple moral. Instead it lingered, a burr under society's tongue, prompting small, daily reconsiderations of what we accept and why. We still watch television. We still laugh at the faces and cadences that make us feel seen. But some viewers now carry a small, private skepticism like a talisman. They listen for the seams. They ask for context. They wonder what is earned and what is curated. They keep one hand on the joke and one on the question. That is not cynicism. It is curiosity. It is the kind of attention that nurtures a more nuanced engagement with art and personality. And if the debate taught anything, it's that nuance is the most valuable commodity we can offer each other in an age of products posing as profits. So, ask yourself again, when you turn on the television and feel inspired, who are you connecting with? A person who has lived through the mess, or a product designed to make you feel something profound enough to come back for more? Does the distinction matter? If it does, what does that ask of you? If it doesn't, what does that say about the kinds of stories we want to be told? These questions are not rhetorical devices meant to punctuate a closing paragraph. They are invitations to attend to how narratives are made, to interrogate the mechanics of fame, and to demand a richer grammar for understanding who we admire and why. In that asking, we might not find a single truth. We might, instead, open space for more honest performance, not only from stage or screen, but from ourselves.